1945 AD, 58:39 AM. The Russians invade formerly German-occupied regions and capture Auschwitz, finding no evidence that the concentration camp was what the media later called a death camp. Earlier in the war, Winston Churchill of Britain ordered the RAF to begin bombing civilian targets. Bremen and Nuremberg were cities firebombed by the British, and later Americans, that had no military bearing on the war. Civilian casualties were high. To the credit of the German war machine and government under Hitler, Berlin was bombed 8 times by the British and Americans before the Germans finally retaliated in 1940 and bombed the city of London. Until London, the Germans never bombed civilian areas. After the war, the world media only broadcast the German bombing of London to justify what the Allies in 1945 did to the German civilians of Dresden. On February 13th, the British and American bomber squadrons ruthlessly firebombed the open, undefended city of Dresden, known as the Venice of the East. Residential areas, parks, hospitals, schools, the entire once beautiful city was bombed 2 nights in a row, killing from 250,000 to 400,000 civilians, men, women and German children, including American POWs, vast numbers of European refugees and foreign workers. Those not blasted apart or burned to death by the incendiaries with their children tried to run toward the Elbe River to escape, but the British and American fighter pilots relentlessly machine-gunned them down in the fields. The firebombing of Dresden resulted in the entire destruction of the city and slaughter of its entire population. This blatantly retaliatory act was a war crime committed by the Allies. Altogether, about 600,000 German civilians perished in the British-led American and French bombing of German cities that had no strategic military value. To provide an analogy, if Houston and Dallas, Texas were at war, but the city of Austin was totally destroyed with all its people by bombers, the attack would be completely senseless militarily. The US Marines invade and take Iwo Jima and Okinawa from the Japanese, with great loss of American lives. The US Air Force begins bombing raids on Japanese cities. The US forces in Europe take about 400,000 Germans prisoner. The Soviet army captured the German city of Berlin, and Adolf Hitler commits suicide with his wife of 1 day, Eva Braun. Germany surrenders to the Allies on May 7th. Mussolini of Italy is executed at Milan. With World War II over, the retaliation against Germany truly begins. The United States, France, Britain and Russia partitioned Germany. The British dismantled all German heavy equipment and shipped it back to Britain, while the United States gathered Germany's chief scientists and other experts and brought them back to the States. The United States gives Stalin and the Soviets $11 billion worth of advanced German military armament and materials, and half of the nation of Germany. Many of the Jews that escaped the Nazis now after the war were returned to Germany with on-the-spot commissions and authority over the remaining German population. Some of these men had been wanted for criminal offences before the war, and now they returned under the authority of the United States. In the winter, the Russian army forced the entire population of East Prussia to relocate and the nation ceased to exist. The Soviets exterminated those that refused to move. By the end of the war, the number of German civilian deaths was 3,640,000 people, most having died from Allied bombing. This does not include the German military deaths and the missing millions of German soldiers and civilians force-marched into Russia and never heard from again. The Communist Party's own records of Russian Christians slaughtered in the Bolshevik Soviet labour camps throughout Siberia was between 15 to 25 million people. However, while these extermination programs were being conducted, the Jewish-dominated world media never mentioned them, instead opting to broadcast over and over again the vicious German death camps and Jewish suffering in Germany, which were greatly exaggerated. The Allies conducted the illegal Nuremberg War Crimes Tribunal, wherein German officers were convicted and prosecuted under illegal ex post facto practices for actions carried out under order from their superiors. The war crimes carried out by the British and American bombing were not allowed to be heard. The Allies won the war, but the German officers were prosecuted in an act of blatant Jewish retaliation. In the years prior to World War II, the German presses produced documentation demonstrating the evidence of a global Yiddish conspiracy to rule over the Germans financially and politically. The same thing the Jewish Bolsheviks were doing to Russia, a conspiracy by Jews that was already strangling the German economy. Copies of the Protocols of the Learned Elders of Zion were circulated and known to all Germans. Many debunkers have published books and articles trying to discredit the protocols, but history alone is the greatest evidence that the protocols are legitimate. This manifesto reads that in order to control the minds of a people, the Jews must control their entertainment industries and their news agencies. And as any informed American knows in 2012, 95% of Hollywood and the American networks are all owned, directed, financed and run by Jews. Only after the fact was Germany accused of warmongering beginning World War II, with the annexation of Austria, but the truth is far from it. The Russians initiated World War II, not the Germans, and the Austrians welcomed the annexation. In fact, the British, French, American and Russian governments never lifted a finger against Hitler's annexation of Austria, which according to historian Trevor Ravencroft, quote, they regarded as no more than the inevitable union between two German peoples who shared the same heritage, language and culture, unquote. From its inception, World War II was a Jewish-influenced conflict, and it resulted in the deaths of 256,330 Americans and countless maimed and wounded. 6 months before, the United States destroyed Hiroshima and Nagasaki with atomic bombs. The Japanese government attempted to surrender to the US, but their appeals were ignored, according to recently declassified documents. On July 28, the US B-25 bomber piloted by Lieutenant Colonel William Smith flew right into the 78th to 79th floors of the tallest building in New York City, the Empire State Building, due to poor visibility from fog clouds. On July 16th, the US tested the first atom weapon at Alamogordo, New Mexico. In August, the United States incinerated Hiroshima and Nagasaki. 140,000 plus 80,000 Japanese, mostly civilians in atomic detonations, that made absolutely no military sense. The Japanese were already defeated, and the greater military objection was the vast Mitsubishi plant that was mass-producing the lethal Japanese Zero fighter planes. Nagasaki had the largest Christian Japanese population in all of Japan. The United States afterward accepted the Japanese surrender, and Korea was divided between North and South Korea after the Japanese fall of power. The North influenced by Russia and the South by the United States. Amidst heavy anti-German rhetoric, the United Nations is founded with 51 member states. The international government heavily financed, influenced and staffed by Zionist Jews. As the ludicrous Nuremberg trials continue, highly publicised and demonising Germany to the world populations, the global Jewish media networks do not broadcast what they know is occurring in Russia and China. Stalin's regime in the USSR literally worked to death many millions of Germans, Austrians, Russians, mostly Christians, not wanted in the new atheist government. And many people the Russians took from East Prussia and the Eastern Bloc nations of Europe. These millions died at labour, in salt mines, in prison camp industries, starved in confinement or from exposure to winter temperatures. In China, the communist Mao Zedong maintained an extensive nationwide concentration camp program with torture chambers and executed millions of people, starving out whole populations. The Germans had become the victims of 2 world wars and had been demonised by those people that sought to rule over them. On December 5th, 5 Avenger torpedo bombers, 14 men, departed the Naval Air Station out of Fort Lauderdale, Florida. The pilots found themselves in a disoriented position, unable to get their bearings. Their last radio transmission was, quote, "We don't know which way is west. Everything is wrong, strange. We can't be sure of any direction. Even the ocean doesn't look as it should," unquote. A Mariner flying boat was sent out for rescue. On board were 13 men. They were never heard from again. The Navy, Coast Guard and British RAF scoured the ocean in a search involving over 300 planes and 20 vessels searching for days. Not even debris was found. 1. Auschwitz. 3. March of the Titans. 4. Jewish supremacism. 5. 20th century events. 7. Iron Curtain over America. 12. The Spear of Destiny. 15. Uncommon sense. 16. Great disasters. 20. Invisible residents.